Okay, good morning everyone and welcome again to Wednesday morning's online seminar. Today we will be looking at Novation with Richard Silver, Senior Partner at Silver Shemmings Ash. As always, if you have any questions, if you could use the Q&A tool in your bottom toolbar, and Richard will endeavour to answer as many of these as possible at the end of his presentation. Again, if you have anything specific you'd like to ask Richard, he's always available via email, richardsilver@silverllp.com. Richard, over to you.
Thank you, Julie. Good morning to you all. Those of you who know me will be aware that my background is in construction. Before turning to be a lawyer, I was both the construction director and chief surveyor for some construction companies. I had held roles of contracts manager and senior surveyor on certain sites, and which included certain design and build contracts where we had a novated architect. I can be honest, on some of those projects, the relationship between us as the contractor with the novated architect did at times get a little strained. We didn't always see quite eye to eye. And I'm going to address that during our presentation today. There's a brief agenda of what we're going to try to cover in the time. The starting point is to try and explain exactly what novation is. Now, under a contract, and those of you who have listened to my seminars on contract formation will be aware that to have a contract, both parties must provide consideration. Consideration is what, in effect, they are doing in return for the other party's consideration. So on a traditional construction contract, the contractor carries out the work and the employer pays. So the benefit to the employer is having the works undertaken, and the burden is paying the contractor. Similarly, under the same contract, the contractor has the benefit of being paid, but the burden of having to undertake the works. Under a novation agreement, it is both the benefits and the burdens that are transferred. So in other words, it is like let's just say the consultant was originally employed by the employer. The employer effectively takes off his shoes and the contractor puts his feet into those shoes. So the contract is no longer between the employer and the consultant, but instead between the consultant and the contractor. It follows that the consultant can no longer seek payment from the employer because that agreement has been rescinded and has come to an end, and instead seeks to be paid by the contractor. Similarly, the contractor now takes on all the obligations in regards to payments of that consultant. And sometimes the agreement that is effectively transferred maybe hasn't been put together properly, and or the parties aren't fully understanding of their respective positions, and which creates problems. We need to identify the differences between novation and assignment, because quite often the two are somewhat misunderstood and confused. So the easiest example of an assignment to deal with in the first instance is in regards to the appointment of subcontractors by the contractor. The contractor is employed by the employer to undertake the works, yet he then goes on to place subcontractors who then undertake those works. Whilst the contractor has appointed those subcontractors, there is generally no contractual relationship or link between the subcontractor and the employer. And therefore, if the subcontractor carries out works wrongfully, the employer can have no right of redress generally against the subcontractor other than through either a collateral warranty or possibly Third-Party Rights Act. But basically, in the main case, there is no direct link. As a consequence of that, should the contractor subsequently go into receivership, the employer has no way of getting to the subcontractor in seeking damages for any failures in the works that the subcontractor has undertaken. To overcome this, it is not uncommon for there to be warranties, collateral warranties. And as the term collateral means, it runs aside the actual subcontract. And what it does is to create a link between the employer and the subcontractor so that the employer can go after the subcontractor if there is any breach. Clearly, obvious benefits to the employer, and where we have large subcontract packages, it is not uncommon for there to be warranties. The similar occurs in the situation where there's been a novated architect or any architect on a project who's employed by the contractor. It is most common that all consultants employed by the contractor enter into warranties so that there can be a link between them and the employer. Again, identifying the difference between what is a novation, where the two parties are in contract with each other, and an assignment where the contractor is still linked to the employer and not the subcontractor or his consultants. Now, under assignment, the general rule is unless the contract states otherwise, a party can assign. Now, examples where there are provisions that require consent is the JCT. In the JCT form, it provides that if the contractor wants to subcontract works, he should notify the employer and get his agreement. And there is some cases indicating that where the contractor has failed to get such agreement, it can potentially be a repudiation, which the employer may elect to accept to bring the contract to an end. But under the JCT, there is a simple requirement of the contractor to notify the employer of each and every subcontractor he seeks to appoint and to get the employer's agreement prior to such subcontracting. Under the NEC, for example, there are slightly more onerous clauses. In the NEC, it requires that where the contractor intends to subcontract, he must get the employer's approval, as with the JCT, but the terms are deemed to be the NEC subcontract terms. If they are not, the contractor is meant to advise the employer of what the terms he seeks to put between him and the subcontractor, and there must be a provision within that subcontractor to act in mutual respect and so forth as provided under the main contract under the NEC. So as a starting point, if you are ever seeking to assign, do ensure what you are seeking to assign can be done under the contract and that you have met the necessary requirements, including quite often approval. But generally, unless the contract expressly provides that you have to get the employer's approval, the contractor can assign at any time. Just quickly, whilst we're doing assignment, I mentioned the issue of warranties. In those warranties, quite often you give a warranty with regards to the contractor to potential beneficiaries to the employer. Let's just say, for example, tenants or people who are buying buildings. In the warranty, you should ensure that there is never more than a permission to allow more than 2 assignments. As I've said, if it doesn't say otherwise, in the warranty, the employer could assign as many times as they liked, passing it down and down and down, which would create far more problems to the contractor. And indeed, in some cases, they can't even get insurance to cover it. So when you're looking at warranties, do make sure that the assignment is limited. Now, dealing with novation, as I have said, it is a completely new contract. It basically displaces the contract between the employer and the architect and is replaced by a contract between the contractor and the architect. Now, there can be substantial benefits in doing so for the employer. Now, under the JCT design and build contract, I've been involved in many over the years, and the way the process is generally started is the employer appoints an architect. The architect basically goes off to get planning permission and then produces, amongst other things, a set of drawings. Generally, those drawings then form part of what are called the employer's requirements, and the employer goes out to tender to contractors to obtain prices to undertake works as per those employer's requirements. As part of that tender process, the contractor submits a set of contractors' proposals, and if those contractors' proposals are agreed, a contract is entered into. However, that is how it is generally meant to work under the JCT as unamended. But as I'm sure you are all aware, it is very rare that a JCT design and build is not amended. Indeed, more often than not, I would suggest, it is always amended, and it is amended particularly in regards to the design obligation. Under the JCT unamended, the employer is responsible for the employer's requirements and any design therein. So if there is any failure in the ERs, this will constitute a change, and the contractor would be entitled to boast both loss and expense and extensions of time, and to the extent the works are varied, to a variation. But I'm sure it will come as no surprise that more often than not, that provision is amended to the effect that the contractor takes total responsibility for the design, including the design originally undertaken by the architect for the employer. So that presents a problem. We also have a situation under the JCT that the employer's requirements and the contractor's proposals are on an equal standing, to the effect that if there is any conflict, the contract actually doesn't deal with it in any great detail. But again, that is generally amended to the effect that the employer's requirements have priority over the contractor's proposals. We then also have provisions in there for changes post the base date, which entitle the contractor to, again, a variation and potentially extensions of time. And yet again, that is all too often amended to the effect that the contractor takes total responsibility. So in my experience, under design and build contracts, probably 90% of the time, the contractor is responsible for all the design, not only that which he undertakes, but that which is included within the novation agreement, or rather, which is undertaken by the architect for the employer prior to any novation. Now, the last thing I'd like to just simply address is that the amount of detail that is included within the employer's requirements can vary from project to project. On some projects, I've seen the employer's requirements being very, very brief, and it is down to the contractor to basically develop that design to enable the works to be undertaken. And as part of that design obligation, the contractor must submit to the employer all the drawings for approval. And there is indeed a design approval procedure in the back of the JCT, where there is effectively a traffic light system. You have A, B, and C. A is approved, B is approved but note our comments, C is you could do better, which I often got when I was back at school. But the C means you cannot proceed as your design as it stands, and you must have to reissue. So now, having established under the design and build contract the obligations upon the contractor to undertake the design and complete the design, we need to consider how this is affected by novation. Now, in order to undertake a novation, all three parties who are involved must have agreed to such novation. So in other words, where the employer initially appoints the architect to undertake the initial design, if they intend to novate that agreement, they must have the agreement of the architect. And it must, in that particular contract, stipulate how that novation is to occur and under what circumstances. And therefore, within the consultancy agreement, there should actually be a copy of the novation agreement and to which the architect has agreed. If there is no such novation agreement in there, but rather simply an agreement to novate, that is what is called an agreement to agree. And of those of you who have heard that term will be aware that an agreement to agree is unenforceable. The reason for that is I'm the employer and I say, I would like you to agree to novation, and you say, yep, I will agree to that. So I say, these are the terms of the novation agreement, and then you say, no, I won't agree to those. And I say, but you've agreed to assign to novation. I said, yeah, I have, but not on the terms you propose. I will only agree on these terms. And unless the employer agrees to the terms being proposed by the architect can simply say, well, I'm not entering into the novation agreement. So very carefully, you need to include the terms of the novation agreement in the contract to the architect. What then happens is you then enter into the design and build contract with the contractor. And within that contract as well, you must have an express provision that provides that there will be a novation, that the contractor will agree to such novation. And again, you need to have the novation agreement included. If again, there is no such novation agreement included, the contractor is under an obligation to agree to novation agreement, but agreements to agree are unenforceable. Now, for those of you who are contractors, you should be aware that when you get the JCT contract and the novation agreement, you must also obtain a copy of the original agreement placed between the employer and the architect or other consultant. If you don't do that, you will not know what the agreement that is being novated to you provides for. We now need to consider when the employer originally enters into an agreement with the consultant, what the employer has asked the consultant to do. Now, to me, there does seem to be some sort of conflict here. In one breath, one could say to the employer, well, you want to not only establish what you want to have done, but you also want to set down within the architect's obligations all the things that you may believe the contractor requires. Now, in the first instance, I would suggest to you that the employer may well not know what the contractor may require. And indeed, in seeking to establish what is required to be done, may ask the architect for their view. Now, as a contractor, I'm going to want the architect to do a number of things. Quite obviously, I'm going to want that architect to complete the design, but I may also want them to provide additional detailing over and above that which is required for me to issue to the employer under the contract. I may wish them to go down to site and to deal with certain things on a regular basis. There may be lots of things that I want the architect to do, but the employer is unlikely to know of these requirements, and even the architect may not know of the requirements. So the original contract that is put together between the employer and the architect may be woefully inadequate for what I want once that architect is novated. There is a further point in that whatever I ask as the employer, the architect to undertake, that will be included or taken due account of in their fee. Now, the fee which the architect seeks to be charged, the contractor should include that as part of their tender. So the more things I, as the employer, ask the architect to undertake, the higher the tender price that is likely to come back to me from the contractor. So arguably, I, as the employer, want the architect to do as little as possible. There is then the opposite side. We have the situation where the employer, once the novation occurs, may still want the architect, for example, to act as the employer's agent or to do other tasks that are in the JCT design and build as the role of the employer's agent. Well, they can't. Once the contract has been novated, the relationship between the employer and the contract and the architect comes to an end. The architect is no longer employed by the employer. He is instead both employed and paid by the contractor. So anything the employer asks, the architect has no contractual obligation to comply with post the novation agreement. And it is this that generally creates problems. And indeed, on projects I've been involved in, both when I was in the construction industry and in acting for clients, has identified these nature of problems arising. I will deal with two of them. The first one was a large design and build contract and refurbishment of an existing building. There was an architect employed by the architect. That architect then was novated to the contractor, and everything, as far as people were concerned, went well. The works were completed and the contractor submitted their final account. And included within the final account was a very large variations stroke change account. And within it, there was loads and loads of variations where the base design had been enhanced. By way of example, within the basement, there had been lots of areas which were not properly used. And the architect had issued design drawings, as had been discussed with the employer, post novation, underlined, and had then produced the drawings which the contractor had undertaken. As part of that process, the contractor had submitted the relevant drawings to the employer, and the employer had very happily put an A against them. Yep, carry them out, that's fantastic. And it resulted in substantial additional cost to the contractor in undertaking those works. But when they sought payment for these variation stroke changes, the employer came back and said, well, we haven't instructed them. And that was quite right. They'd never been instructed. What had actually happened is that the architect, as novated, had produced revised drawings showing loads of additional works on them, and which the contractor had not A, checked to see if they were additional, and B, had not got any instruction. Rather, all they'd done is put them forward as their contractor's proposals, which had been approved by the employer, and therefore the contractor was entitled to no payment, no extension of time, and no loss and expense. As you can imagine, the contractor was not best pleased. So, what happened? Well, there was a claim against the architect for breach of contract and negligence, and the contractor won. The architect had gone way beyond what his obligations were in the contract. He had been negligent in seeking to put additional works that were within the works to that was required under the employer's requirements. He had both breached his terms of agreement, the agreement as novated, and had also been negligent. So far as negligence, it is compared to what a reasonable architect would have done. And what the architect was obliged to do was to carry out the works as per the employer's requirements and the CPs. He hadn't. He had done far more than was ever required under either of those two documents. He was thereby in breach and negligent. The second example I would refer you to is a situation where the contractor had always been involved on traditional forms. And therefore his perception was that the architect, as novated, was a representative or administrator acting on and for the employer, which he wasn't because he'd been novated. So as the works were progressed and when there were problems occurring, they sought the approval of the architect. Well, the architect is their employed architect. So when the job was nearing the end and they said, look, what we've done, the employer said, well, I'm not approving it. And they said, but the architect's approved it. And the point is, well, that's irrelevant. You either have or have not complied with the ERs and CPs and building regs. And as far as we're concerned, you haven't. And therefore, all the works that you've undertaken need to be rectified. So again, the architect had mistaken what his rights and obligations were. So what I would suggest to you very strongly is that where you're in a situation that you have a novated architect, there are two key things that you need to do. Number one is, as an employer, you need to ensure that the architect is going to be novated and that both parties agree, and that you set down within the base agreement exactly what the architect is to do. Once the contractor then gets the invitation to tender, as part of that, he should review A, the novation agreement, and B, the terms of appointment of the architect that is being novated. Now, it is my experience that generally what is included within those terms is insufficient. So what I would suggest is the contractor should enter into negotiations with the architect to expand upon the terms and obligations that are required of the architect to ensure that the architect is going to do everything that the contractor requires. Having then agreed that, the original agreement can be novated with a supplementary provisions of what further things are to be undertaken and agreed. Having done that, I then think it is very important to arrange a meeting with the architect and to explain to him in no uncertain terms, and it could be an engineer or otherwise, what this agreement means. And what it means is he is no longer appointed by the employer. His terms are that he's employed by the contractor, and you should set down very clearly what that means and what he is to do to ensure that you don't fall into the sort of problems I have identified earlier in regards to the two situations I suggested. Because you must remember, there is likely to be a fairly strong relationship between the employer and the architect. Indeed, the employer is likely to have met the architect first, has spoken with him and has got him this project. And indeed, he may get him other projects in the future. Also, so far as architects are concerned, the majority of them have experience of only ever having worked for the employer and not the contractor. It is something new to them. And therefore, I think it is very important for you to set down clearly what this agreement means. Now, I'm going to deal with one final problem that arises with regards to novation. And this occurred within Blyth and Blyth versus Carillion. And I've got a number of slides that set down what actually happened. Now, as I've identified before, generally when the employer enters into, looks at the initial stages of the contract, they employ consultants. And in this particular situation, the employer had appointed consultants, including Blyth and Blyth, as engineers. And in producing the employer's requirements, Blyth and Blyth set down a base design. And within that, the design, they unfortunately had hugely underestimated the amount of steel reinforcement. So what then happened is that was tendered for, and the contractor, quite rightly, looking at the amount of steel reinforcement estimated, priced on that basis and was successful and secured the project. Now, within the contract that was provided, there was a novation agreement, but additionally, there was amendments to the contract to the effect that the contractor took total responsibility for all the design, not only the design that he had undertaken, but the design undertaken by the employer prior to the placement of the contract and prior to the novation of the agreement with Blyth and Blyth to the contractor. Now, having secured the project, the contractor then sought to undertake the works and suddenly found themselves being required to purchase and install huge amounts of steel reinforcement, far, far in excess of what they had tendered for. So their first line of attack was to say that this constituted a variation, a change. But because the contract had been amended, it didn't. Whatever reinforcement was required was the problem for Carillion, because they took responsibility for all the design, including the initial design where the reinforcement had been underestimated. So they had absolutely no right of action against the employer. So their second line of attack was to go after Blyth and Blyth, the engineers, because in the end, it was them who had underestimated the amount of steelwork. Now, one initially looking at that would think that there was a clear breach of contract, and indeed you would have thought that Blyth and Blyth had been negligent. However, that is not what was decided. Now, this is all to do with a novation agreement. And what the courts effectively decided is that one needs to consider when the breach occurred. And the breach occurred prior to the contract having been placed with the contractor. So what they did was to say, at the time this steelwork element was designed, the agreement was with the employer. So we first need to decide whether there was a breach. And their decision on that is that there was a clear breach. The engineer had not done what was required of a reasonable engineer. They had underestimated the amount of steelwork, and that represented a breach. But the second step they had to take was to have due consideration as to what was the loss incurred at that time to the employer, not to the contractor, but to the employer. And there had been no loss. The employer had placed the contract with the contractor to the effect that it was the contractor who took responsibility. So whilst there had been a breach, there had been no loss. The contractor is then put in the shoes of the employer at that time and therefore would have any claim that the employer had. And the employer didn't have a claim. because whilst there'd been a breach, there had been no loss. So unfortunately, Carillion was unable to take any action or to recover any monies from the employer or from the engineer. So how does one overcome that problem? Well, it's very simple. What you have to do is to have an express provision within the agreement, be it the novation agreement or the base agreement or another agreement, to the effect that the employer, the engineer stroke architect stroke consultant shall be liable for any breaches that occurred prior to the novation, or alternatively a term that says that they cannot rely upon any argument that there was no loss. But very simply, what we have to do is to ensure that there is an express provision that allows the contractor to seek damages for the period prior to novation. If you don't have that, you will have no right of action. And indeed, I am only too aware of many consultants who will not agree to such additional provision, with effect that the contractor's either got to seek to appoint another consultant to overview the works, or simply takes that risk. Now, within the notes, I have a number of other slides dealing with whether or not a novation agreement has been entered into, and what happens when circumstances that a party acts as if there's been a novation when in fact there hasn't. And the basic, as you'll see from the slide, situation is that you have to have a clearly agreed novation agreement. It must be in there that all three parties have reached agreement. Absent agreement from one of those parties, there will be no novation. There is also a case that says that where there has been a novation of only an element of the original agreement survives, but only to the extent of the works that have not been novated. But as you'll see from the slides, there has been, in addition to Blyth and Blyth, many disputes as to whether or not a novation agreement exists and what the liability is thereunder. There is a further case that I've referred to within the notes, also deals with where a contractor has effectively novated all its obligation to a purchaser of the contractor, with effect that the employer, when he found that there were defects in the works, could actually go after the new contractor. So do be aware. So I'm going to try and summarize all that I've gone through so far. So number one, novation and assignment are different. Under assignment, what we have is that the original contract is retained, but there is a further contract between one of the parties and another party where that other party is required to undertake certain work. So as an example, we'll go back to the subcontractor. Employer appoints contractor. Contractor assigns certain obligations in regards to the undertaking of those works to a subcontractor, but there is no contractual link between the subcontractor and the employer. To overcome that, the main way of dealing with that is by collateral warranties. A novation, however, is where the initial contract is brought to an end and replaced with another one between a different party. So we have three parties: the employer and the contractor. The employer and the architect initially into an agreement where the architect is to undertake certain works. Thereafter, that agreement is novated to the effect that the architect is employed by the contractor, and hence any contractual relationship between the employer and the architect comes to an end upon the novation. To achieve that, all three parties must agree. And to enable that to occur, in the agreement with the consultant, the architect, and the agreement with the contractor, there should be a novation agreement written down with full terms so that the actual form of novation is agreed. What then should happen is the contractor, when being made aware that there is going to be a novation, should review very carefully the agreement that is being novated to ensure that it fully meets his requirements. He should ensure that what the architect is obliged to do under that agreement meets all his requirements that he will look to have occur during the execution of the works. He should also, the contractor, seek to ensure that the architect, the consultant, is to be held responsible for any defects in his design pre the novation to overcome the problem with Blyth and Blyth. I would then strongly suggest that all three parties, or at the very least, the architect and the contractor, meet and to explain what the novation means and what the architect's actually obliged to do. And what the architect is obliged to do is to act for the contractor and only to carry out the works that the contractor is obliged to do under the contract. So far as the employer is concerned, do be aware that as soon as you've novated that agreement, the architect or other consultant is no longer under your employ, and to some extent should not be communicating with you. And particularly, you should not be asking them to do certain design development changes to meet what you require. Your contact should be to the contractor, who should be accordingly instructed. Okay, hopefully that has been of assistance. Julie, are there any questions? Hello, Julie.
Sorry, I lost my unmute button there, which is,
all right,
some people would say was a good thing. Yes, we do have a couple of questions. Let me put those to you. What is the approach in dealing with difficulties determining where liability lies for design work carried out before novation?
Well, that's the very point that applies within Blyth and Blyth. In very simple terms, prior to novation, the architect is responsible to the employer for any design failures. And if there are design failures, there has been a clear breach, and therefore any loss that has occurred, the architect, the employer at that time could seek to recover that loss. Once the novation occurs, the liability of the architect is transferred to the contractor, and effectively the agreement with the employer is extinguished. So the result is that the architect is responsible to the contractor. But following the Blyth and Blyth situation, in order to recover any loss pre-novation, it must be shown the employer has incurred a loss. If you can't do that, you need to have a bespoke provision within your contract that the employer is responsible for such breaches.
Okay. And then someone else has said they'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how best to novate a demolitions contractor to the main contractor.
I don't think it's any different to any consultant. Any business company, whether it be engineers, architects, civil engineers, or particular subcontractors or suppliers or otherwise, are all the same. I mean, the first thing as an employer, I would suggest strongly that you get a collateral warranty with the particular organisation, because if you're going to novate it, you're effectively going to extinguish that direct link. So I would strongly suggest that you, in the first instance, make sure there's a collateral warranty. Number two is when you place the order with the subcontractor, or the demolition contractor in this instance, ensure that within the contract you set down clearly all the works that they're going to undertake, and then include a provision within that agreement that their contract is to be novated, and include within it a copy of the novation agreement so that they've agreed to it. When you then place the contract with the contractor, ensure that within the contract with the contractor you have a copy of the subcontract and a copy of the novation agreement. So it's exactly the same as other consultants, and by so doing, there ought not to be any problems.
Okay, someone here is asking, sorry, what should an architect do if post-novation they are asked by the employer for a copy of their site inspection report for the contractor, especially if there are issues that the contractor may not be happy about?
Very simple question, a very simple answer. What they should do, underlined, should, is they should simply contact the contractor and say, I've been contacted by the employer who has requested the following. Am I entitled to, am I able to issue it, or are you able to issue it?
Right.
Alternatively, what they should do is, and which may be far easier, is to simply get a copy or ask the employer to put it in writing, then write to the write to the contractor and the employer and saying, I confirm receipt of the attached correspondence from the employer, which I provide to the contractor for their action. Or you write to the employer and say, please can you contact the contractor direct for such requests. But in very simple terms, do not comply unless the contractor agrees. Because if you comply without having got the contractor's agreement, you may well put yourself in breach of contract.
Right, so that's an important point there. Okay, that seems to be the end of our questions for today. So thank you very much, Richard, and thank you everyone for attending. As always, as we said earlier, if there's anything specific you wish to speak to Richard about, please feel free to email him on richardsilver@silverllp.com. Some of you will see later on tonight with John Sharp on insurance and what you need to know. And Richard is back with us again for Hot Topics, JCT Liquidated Damages, tomorrow evening at 6. If you'd like to attend either of these, email seminars@silverllp.com. In the meantime, have a great day, everyone, and we'll see you all again soon. Thank you, Richard.
Okay, thanks very much.